Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy. This is our week in review podcast where we look at the previous week's episodes and look at the comments, and Charlene asks questions and we discuss it sort of together. No preparation for this at all. Dangerous Policy is for intelligent people wanting to discuss interesting issues that affect our life and society. So, handing over to the boss.
The boss? Oh, I'm the boss? Nah, he's just saying I'm the boss because I make him look good on every episode. It is hence why our production value has the roof. But
It's getting there.
Yeah, it is getting there. We did talk about a lot of things this past week. One thing that really stood out to me in one episode, I definitely think is needed among graduates like myself, is reflection of the role of university. Because you posed the question, are hiking degrees worthless? And this was from respect for, because they're doubling the humanities degrees and then reducing the STEM degrees. It's I don't think the government should, per se. And I know why you think maybe they have, because
Well, I think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
And no, I mean, as I said in the episode, I don't agree with the policy, but I agree with the criticism, which is that universities are not preparing people adequately for working life, and they're not even completing the missions that they say that they're undertaking, which is to open minds and promote critical thinking. To the contrary, they seem to be indoctrinating a lot of students, particularly in the humanities.
Can you think of examples where you feel like it's happened?
Oh, well, I mean, that would get really political, because then I'd be singling out particular courses. But I think to say it generically, any course that says, for example, that science is somehow colonialized, that our understanding of the universe and how we interpret the world, which is through the scientific method and is the only credible way of furthering human knowledge through rational inquiry, is somehow a social construct that has delegitimized the knowings of indigenous peoples, for example, or that somehow our social system is a construction of ideological based on illegitimate power balances and hierarchy, that isn't tested through proper multivariate analysis. So, for example, if you say that one group is disadvantaged, well, first of all, specifically, what do we mean by disadvantage? So, to be precise, let's say you've got a group of people who suffer more from COVID, right? Well, if your immediate explanation for that is racism and is not scientifically evidence-based, based on the location of where these people live, their diets, the behaviors, et cetera. For example, New York City had a massive wave of COVID, and people were saying that Black Americans were disproportionately affected. Now, okay, that's true, and it's unfortunate. We need to look at what that is. Is it because the disease is racist, which was the common CNN narrative, or is it because the epicenter of the disease happened to be in a Black neighborhood, right? Which was the actual facts, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously, I'm drawing a bow from this, but if you are creating someone out of university that doesn't have an open mind, that doesn't actually have so what university should do is equip students with the ability to have a rational inquiry and to be able to be like, okay, well, here's a problem. Here is how I'm going to ascribe my series of causal effects. I might have my hypothesis, but I'm going to test that hypothesis rigorously, as opposed to just telling students how the world is constructed and marking them in accordance with their ideological conformity, right? So if you have a student that says, I believe that the world is flat, right? If the university is teaching someone that the world is flat, and obviously that's not what's happening, but I'm giving this as an example, and then you grade people based on how flat the world is, then you're not actually creating people who challenging the status quo, or opening minds, or furthering human knowledge, or coming up with effective solutions. You're just creating a hotbed of tribal division. So look, there's nothing wrong with having strong beliefs. Okay, there's nothing wrong with having values and to try and drive a change in the world. But university is supposed to be there to challenge those suppositions, not to just impart them. And I think university has done that extremely poorly across the world in recent years.
Where does that come from? Do you have any hypothesis of how it's like widely shifted from a place of critical thinking to place to, like you said in the video, it was like, we're not trying to bring indoctrinate good people, or we're trying to have thinkers.
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I've done the depth of thinking to have a good answer for that. That's a really good question, though. How did this happen? I think at first people just didn't take it too seriously. That it was just another set of voices. See, like if you've got people who say crazy things at university, that's kind of the place for it, right? So it's only at the point where they start shutting down people who have different voices that it becomes a real problem, and they start signing open letters to get people fired from tenure and things like that, because they happen to, or the safe spaces at university and so on. I think that it happened as a result of the loss of the sense, starting among the student body, but then also to many academics as well, the sense that university is there to challenge you. That the concept of the safe space at university is where I think it probably began. At least that's a marker. I'm not sure it's a cause, but it was a good marker of the change where, and the sense that, like a lot of things are motivated at the start by goodwill. You want to make it more inclusive, get more people who perhaps wouldn't have thought of going to university to be part of university life. And therefore you want to create an environment that facilitates that exchange. So people want to feel, quote unquote, psychologically safe to be able to have those kinds of engagement. So so for example, let's say you have a really controversial opinion. Let's say you think that North Korea is the best thing ever, right? Obviously not saying you do, but just imagine, right? Then you should have an environment where you can freely express that view at a university campus and not feel like you're going to just be completely ostracized. And so that, I think, was the original motivation. That's how most people interpreted it at first. Okay, we want to create an inclusive environment where people can have those conversations safely. But then what that translated to was, if you have a differing point of view on any of these subjects, you're making everyone else unsafe, ergo you should be cancelled. So I think that's the perversion of what's happened. Exactly why? I think perhaps some courses receive too much indulgence from the university campuses. So there are some courses that just aren't factually based, right? And they're there primarily for political reasons. I don't want to name them here, but basically it's clear that they don't have the weight of science behind them to justify the claims that they're making. And yet, for various political reasons, they've been supported. Now, I'm not theoretically against that in every instance, because you don't want to just have everything driven by one discipline, but that did create a sense of entitlement. That instead of teaching people to think about a particular ideology in the context of all other ideologies and make your own view, it's like, here's the truth, and if you deviate from that, then you're a bad person. So yeah, it's a difficult one. Getting back to is the university degree worthless? There's also an economic side to this, which is in the United States, I wouldn't recommend anyone go to university. This is a bold thing to say, because
screw you, Harvard. Keep going.
Oh, Harvard especially. Harvard is a disgrace. And I'm embarrassed for every encounter I've had with that institution. The university in the United States is, first of all, incredibly expensive. Okay, so it's not like Australia, where we have a really good system, right, where there's a recognition that university is supposed to benefit both the state and the individual. Okay, Ergo, there's a mutual responsibility. So in Australia, what happens is you get a loan. That loan is really low interest. It's not, commercial loans or anything like that. And you only start repaying it once you're earning over a certain amount of money, okay? With the assumption that having a university degree will make you earn a lot more than those repayments. And also you'll generate more economic activity as a consequence of your higher level of qualification and productivity that will benefit the state as well. So it'll pay it forward. Now that is a really great system, and obviously there are tinkers problems with every system, but that has worked really well for us, I think, over the course of 35, 40 years. And extended a lot of opportunity that may not have otherwise had, while maintaining a high quality product in terms of tertiary education. Whereas in the United States, the student loan is the only loan you can't declare bankruptcy on, right? It follows you wherever you go. The interest rate is obscene, and the cost of the tuition is ridiculously high.
Yeah, $200,000.
Oh, it just and so what that does, it has several problems. One, the extra income you earn as a consequence of your degree may well not exceed your cost of your degree. It really perverts the industry itself. So let's say you get a medical degree. Well, your incentives for flogging off pharmaceutical products to patients and getting kickbacks for that is extremely high if you're in enormous debt, right? You're basically encouraging a sense of perversion and bribery. There's also a sense that you may be like the best poet ever, right? That might be your raw talent, and you go to university to develop those skills, right? Well, you're not going to go out and be a starving poet trying to make that art your own. You're going to go work for whoever pays you and do the most monotonous advertising gig that you can in order to pay your debt, right? So you actually restrict mobility rather than promote mobility, because people won't travel to where they feel they can make the best contribution, because most people will make a certain amount of financial sacrifice in order to do work that they think is of value to others. I think this podcast is a really great example of that. I'm not making money out of this, but I'm hoping it's adding value. So if it is adding value, please do like and subscribe, because it really grows the channel and helps us out. And yet, if you are in enormous debt, then you don't have that freedom to do that. You've only got the freedom to do what it is that someone is willing to pay for. Yeah. So it's actually, in the United States, education has become a fundamentally economically irrational act. You should not go to university if you're in the United States, if you're a smart person, okay? That is a terrible thing to say. It's just, I think economically, that is a fact. You do not deserve to be in the enormous debt that system puts you under. It is a bad idea to do so. If you can find any opportunity for good and meaningful work without having a university qualification, go ahead and do it, because it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that definitely brings the question of is university, does it still hold up to this day? Because I feel like people can actually get work without going to university and upskilling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
obviously not medical doctors. I think there's definitely a role in that respect. Yeah. I don't want people self-trained.
There's a what's called the survivorship bias, which it makes this a really difficult topic to kind of get your head around intellectually, because the answer is I'm not sure, right? Because so the survivorship bias is based around this idea where during World War II, people were looking at all the planes that were coming back and seeing where they'd been shot, right? And being like, oh, okay, well, the planes have all been shot in these places, so we better increase their survivability by putting in extra armor and stuff like that. Well, it didn't help anything, because the problem wasn't that they were getting shot in those places. It was the places that they weren't showing up that was the real problem, because the planes that didn't come back were the ones that were shot in those other places. And the ones that did come back were shot in the places that didn't actually destroy the plane, right? Yeah. So it caused a bias that skewed the results and meant that people were focusing on entirely the polar opposite problem of what the problem was. And now it's become a bit of a trope. So in the context of this, There are plenty of people who I really respect and admire who did not complete university, who've gone on to extraordinary things. And I'd put at the top of that list Peter Thiel, who was a founder of PayPal, early investor in Facebook, multi-billionaire, tech kind of entrepreneur, but also a tremendous thinker in his own right. And he actually has a scholarship encouraging people to drop out of college. It's like instead of going to college, he's like, all right, if you're in college, I'll give you a scholarship to leave, right? Because he and I'm sure would see the college campuses in a similar light, on the basis that you can do better outside of it. So that's true. It's also true that you can increase your knowledge in any subject at all. And like I said in their video, once upon a time, you actually need to go to university to get a lot of this knowledge. If you wanted to learn about Kant and Plato and stuff like that, it was hard to develop those things. Now there are courses online, YouTube videos, all wonderful audiobooks and things that you can learn any subject.
There's also the rise of misinformation.
There is. But I'm not sure that university graduates have been any better at distinguishing between those things. But no, you're right. It is a fair point. However, this could all be wrong as well, in that it's easy to point to the Peter Thiels of the world and say, well, obviously he didn't need university, right? Even though he did have a university degree. I think he went to Princeton, got his law degree, realized it was a waste of time, and then did something else. It's easy to look at those people that are success stories who didn't have the degrees, and then you have to compare them to all the other people that don't have degrees in their economic outlook, and you go, ooh, well, there is still a problem there. The question is, and this is where rational inquiry becomes important, the question is whether or not it was the university degree that gave them access to economic opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise had, which is true for things like engineering, medicine, that sort of stuff, the professions, or the sorts of people who go to university and are successful at university would have been successful anyway because they're those kinds of people. They kind of highly intelligent, driven, learning, and they wouldn't have needed the university. It's just the correlation, not causation. So I'm not sure about that. What I can say is that the knowledge that whether or not you have the qualification, different story, but the knowledge that you would have gained at university is accessible in many other ways that you wouldn't have had previously, and often at a much, much more reasonable price and at a higher quality amount of value. But again, in my episode, I did talk about the desirability of going to university for things that were the direction of this century. So if you want to learn things in AI, if you want to learn things in gene therapy, if you want to learn things in new forms of computer science and quantum computing, all of that stuff, go to university because it's definitely financially returned. We have the data to back that up.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. We also talked about, or you talked about Hagia Sophia turning into a mosque. And actually, we saw some people protesting about that nearby.
Oh, yes, we did.
And that's kind of like, and I guess my question after watching it, is you mentioned that this is a very bad idea in terms of, it's going to really affect the relationship between Turkey and Russia.
Turkey and Russia, Turkey and Greece,
yeah.
Turkey and
why is that?
Much of Eastern Europe.
Why is that the case? Is it more like the religious?
Well, I mean, let me put it to you this way. Imagine if St. Peter's Basilica was made into a mosque and how the Catholics would respond. What would be like the equivalent in or in the episode, like I said, Mecca, if that was consecrated as a church. What you're doing is you're completely disregarding the kind of unwritten social compact that exists between great faiths. So for example, Jerusalem, right, which is for all the Abrahamic religions, kind of the most important city, right? So whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, other than Mecca, Medina if you're Muslim, but certainly like the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Mecca, all of that stuff was revealed at Jerusalem. They all kind of cooperate in a really uneasy way, right? So even within, in Jerusalem, there's an amazing church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as it is in the Western kind of Latin Catholic tradition, or the Church of the Anastasi in the Orthodox tradition, same place. And they all share, these different denominations share the church, where I think the Orthodox Church kind of has the most sort of control, and then the other faiths have their own sort of wings, and they work together because they respect that it's sacred to everybody, that you can't just unilaterally seize it and say it belongs to us, okay?
But it was once a mosque, wasn't it?
It was originally a church, and was from the century right through to 1453. So for 1,000 years, it was a church, okay, and it was the largest cathedral in the world until St. Peter's Basilica was constructed in the early 16th century, and it was the most important site for Orthodox Christendom, because it was the seat of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is the equivalent, basically. Well, not really the equivalent of the Pope, because the Emperor of Byzantium had that kind of role, but certainly the most important religious official. And so when the Ottomans took it over, yes, as was their habit, they transferred it into a mosque. But you could look at that more generously at the time, because at the time, obviously we're talking Middle Ages, we're also talking, it was a way of not destroying the building, right? Because you suddenly then, you've taken, let's say you're a Muslim army and you've taken a Christian city, right? Well, your first instinct is to destroy the actual cathedral, right? Because you're now a Muslim city, and you don't want this giant monument to Christendom sitting in the middle of your city. Well, a way of getting around that is to turn it into a mosque. But then, like, the conversion to a museum is something you would do in the modern world. Okay, like you go in the modern tradition, and great credit to Kemal Ataturk, founder of Turkey, for thinking this through. If you're a modern state, you don't trample the holiest site of another faith just because it doesn't accord with your own faith, right? If you want to be treated like a modern country with a modern society, like, so, for example, the whole crusade started because it was not possible for pilgrims to reach Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem today is welcoming of all the different faiths, right? And if you're Jewish, you can go to the Temple Mount. If you're a Muslim, you can go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you can go to the Dome of the Rock. And if you're a Christian, you can go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And there is very few restrictions on that. There's just things to keep safety and so on, but nothing. Like the Israeli government would never dream of the fact that because it's a Jewish state, no one else has any right to go to this location. That is just not the way a modern society, modern democracy would think it through. And so for Turkey to take this step, it is massively retrograde.
Yeah, and what is he meant to prove? What is Turkey trying to prove?
Oh, well, that's it. I mean, it's power, I guess. So it's more about a.
Because they had the other. You said that they built another one, the blue
mosque, yeah.
Mosque, like next door neighbor. So it's not like they don't have a place where they can pray.
And look, that was genius on the part of I think Suleiman the Magnificent for doing that, because he's like, well, okay, we've got this giant thing that everybody knows is built by the Christians, right? So why not build a much, much bigger mosque next to it so that people stop seeing it as this greatest thing in the world, right? And that was a smart thing to do. And it worked, like the Blue Mosque is, massively impressive. And the fact is that the Hagia Sophia has been gutted, in part because of the invasion of the Ottomans, but also before that, like, so many of the church treasures had been sold off by the Byzantine leaders in order to try and preserve the empire because it was crumbling, that it lost a lot of its grandeur. So compared to the Blue Mosque, it's just physically nowhere near as impressive. But in terms of spiritually important and historically important, I mean, it's just such a and it's also just like a World Heritage site. I mean, it's this enormously old building, and so much of world history happened in its walls. So yeah, look, it's about Erogden's vanity, basically. Erdogan, President Erdogan of Turkey, he's a massive autocrat, and this is a way for him to shore up domestic support by playing to the religious fanatics within his own country and party. And it's a wildly popular thing domestically because it's just, sticking it to the Christians. But it just has enormously deleterious consequences for religious relations. And it's not just with the Orthodox, which is interesting. Like I've noticed that it plays pretty strongly in the United States right now, where there aren't that many Orthodox Christians, because they see it as an attack by a NATO ally on Christendom itself. I mean, this is the city of which the first emperor of Rome to become Christian converted. Right, he creates his new capital on the Bosphorus between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and he allows Christendom to become prevalent in the empire. He has all of his soldiers do the Cairo, which is sort of a Christian symbol at that time, ahead of a major battle, and after winning the battle, has sacrificed to the Christian god, and then in his dying days, he converts to Christianity formally and is baptized. So it goes from like the Roman Empire persecuting the Christians to being the state religion of the Roman Empire. Extraordinary, and so much of the titular nature of the papacy continues uninterrupted to this day. So the most formal title of the Pope is Supreme Pontiff, which is the same as the Latin, head of the church. So it's I mean, we're talking a lot of history, a lot of tradition, a lot of faith, a lot of feeling, and not much to gain, as you say, like in your question, as implies, is that the cost of doing this is far greater morally, culturally, international, geopolitically, than the benefit. Although the benefit is real in that it makes him more popular.
Domestically, but internationally, everyone's looking.
He's a pariah. He already was a pariah, though. Like he's becoming clearly just another despot.
Okay. We also talked about this week, how much should we blame China for the virus?
Mm-hmm.
And your perspective was quite interesting on a 1 to 10 scale, yes, 1 being it was out of their control. Coronavirus, there's lots of strains of different coronaviruses actually, and it occurs more frequently than people actually understand.
Mm-hmm.
To 10 being it's an attack on the world, and this is how they're going to rule their dominance. And yeah, it did make me reflect a little bit, because I definitely was between the 1 and 5. Was like, not 1 to 5, 5 to 10, because it just frustrates me. And maybe in my perspective, I'm thinking, China, man, if you just put your ego aside and told the world that you're in trouble, perhaps we could have suppressed this faster and they're a bit more transparent about it. Because for a long time, the US was backing China. Like Trump was being like, no, they've got it under control. The World Health Organization also said that too. And so we just let travel happen. And we thought our public health systems would be able to handle it, but it was a lot more severe than I could imagine. And now we're seeing it now, and it's even a bit more of a struggle. I don't know what else to add to this, but yeah, like
I think it's right. I mean, you've actually summed it up really well. I mean, there is my fundamental position is that it's China's fault, but we shouldn't let our anger towards China to cloud out our own shortcomings, to make us not learn the lessons of this public health disaster, and to make us think that somehow China will lose this struggle for global dominance, because I'm not convinced that they will. I think there's a good chance that they'll succeed in their strategic aims, especially if we play down every one of their achievements while being deluded about our own. So as I said in my video, China handled the GFC much better than the West, but people kind of put that down to the fact that it started in the West. Now we have a disease that started in China and they still do better. Okay.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful about forgetting the Sputnik moment, to make sure that we blame China for what is China's responsibility and we hold them to account as a global community. And there's plenty of that, and I went into that in detail. But we don't lose sight of the things that we need to improve if we're going to compete. Because if every time something happens, we just say it's all China's fault and it wasn't anything that we could have done about it, we won't actually become as competent and competitive as we need to be in order to challenge, a Sinocentric world order in which a communist dictatorship, which crushes the rights of pretty much everyone it touches, from Hong Kong to the Uyghurs to even foreign countries like Australia, when we dare to question, we need to shape up. We need to respect the fact that they do some things well, and we need to do those things better.
Yeah, no, I do respect that point. Like, there is no point of channeling all our energy into hating China, whereas, yeah, we definitely have issues in the West that needs to be addressed. And it is an opportunity for us to really reflect on, like, our health systems. Are they sustainable? Even just the way we work. Do you find that the world has definitely changed since this virus was introduced? Like, just our understanding of, again, like, more people are able to work remotely. We have less carbon emissions because not many people are traveling. Businesses are redeveloping their whole, like, structure so they can, become more flexible and utilizing technology more efficiently. Like, if you look at the positive side,
well, like nothing drives innovation like massive disruption. And so, yes, the world is changing rapidly. I wonder whether or not we have yet experienced the true costs. So now, like, over 50 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. That's greater than the working age of New York State, California, and Florida combined. We have a world in which concentrations of wealth are so stark and very much in the hands of those who dominate scalable industries that entire swaths of citizenry are being left not just disadvantaged, but now, because of COVID, completely destitute. We have enormous national debts that arose out of the GFC, and now, just as the economies were back to GFC levels, we've been hit with COVID, and these economies cannot survive. We have everyone went into lockdown to try and do something about this disease. The lockdowns have broadly failed in a lot of parts in the world, and a lot of countries had opened up, and now the disease has spiked. And the question is, can these societies go into lockdown again? Not very clear that they can, either economically or socially. The fact that young people are in a world that no one can give them guidance on, right? So they were already massively disadvantaged in terms of intergenerational equity. So much of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of sort of the boomer generation. Young people take on enormous debts either to get into the housing ladder or just to get an education. And now they're faced with COVID, where they have basically no economic opportunities. the fact that COVID is there's still so many unknowns with COVID, even though it's been around a little while. Like it's unclear, whether we'll ever have a vaccine, whether or not the long-term impact of getting the disease, whether or not your antibodies survive in the system very long, whether this is something that's going to go away, it's going to be with us for generations, and therefore, and very importantly, whether or not if you're in an area that doesn't have much COVID at the moment, whether it can come and change your life all suddenly. So you have very limited amount of confidence to invest in your future. So, for example, pre-GFC and then probably as of a couple of years ago, people probably invested on a 10, 20-year timescale thinking that not much was going to change. And now you've got this massive disruption. It's much harder to see 6 months in the future today than it was to see 10 years in the future 10 years ago, right? Like you could think forward. And one of the reasons that I haven't done a lot of episodes on the US election is despite the polling lead that Biden has, the volatility of the electorate is enormous in the United States, and it's very unclear what the probabilities are. Like I was, out there saying Trump was going to win from 2015 onwards. I mean, and all people had to do was look at the data. They were too foolish to do so. Whereas like now you look at the same data and it's very hard to know what's going to happen because people themselves don't know what they're going to do. And so I don't know. I think the world, and then there's the aftershock. So the geopolitical aftershock. So the world has woken up to China, and that's a good thing. But the big thing that happened there was that with the shutdown of the global economic system, the decision whether or not to continue to trade with China became a conscious one rather than an inherited one. Like most leaders would come to office and they had inherited a dependency on China. When you stop the global economy and you decide whether or not to start it up again, suddenly you think, should we be in bed with a communist dictatorship that suppresses, a billion people, right? It's not, it becomes a thinking choice. And so the world has started to align against China. We've got the conflict of tech companies. We've got in the midst of it, the massive Twitter hack that just shows how vulnerable our online systems are for what was a very, it seemed like a very petty reason. So I know I'm talking like about a lot of stuff, but the fact is the world is dramatically changing, much, much more so than people are equipped to process.
Yeah.
The world changed dramatically between sort of 1913 and 1946. And I think we're going through a similar change, but at a much faster time scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of scary. It is definitely scary that the world continues to change. It's kind of like, but I guess bottom line is we can only control what we can control, right? Like day to day, and do what, I guess, adapt to whatever changes come about. I mean, to my knowledge, they've started the trials, the clinical trials for the vaccine. And they've found positive results, but they're now positive results as in it's safe, but not so much like effectiveness wise. I don't know the dose nowadays. So yeah, we'll just see, I guess, what happens. And I think one thing with China and the US is like, again, these are two really big players. And I still don't really understand. I think we talked a bit earlier, but I don't really understand, what's the biggest conflict between these two countries? Why are they at war with each other so much?
Right, they're not at war with each other as they're going to be. Well, there's multiple layers to that question, and it is the most important question in the world today, more so than COVID, more so than climate change. First of all, no country that is a hegemonic power, that is more powerful than everybody else, can really afford to have another power that is totally contrary to its interests and values rise in such a way as to challenge its position in the world, and much less displace it. Because this doesn't happen very often. Okay, like the US has been the most powerful country that as long as anyone's grandparents can remember.
What
right?
determines power in the world? Did you say military before?
Military and economic size.
Economic size.
And
Okay.
absolutely nothing else. Sorry, soft power people.
Economic size is in like their GDP. Is that what's measured by? Or
Yeah,
other things?
yeah. So basically, how much each person produces times the amount of people that you have. And that's GDP. And then your military forces is often a significant marker of that. Economic size is the most important thing, and followed by military size, because it's easier to convert economics to military than it is from military to economics, right? So it's more important to have economics, but certainly military power. People go to war with the forces they have, so having a tremendous military power is critically important. So at the moment, the United States, certainly in military power, greatly exceeds China, but that is a misnomer in many ways. Number one, the US has deployments around the world. They've got 35,000 people in Germany, for Christ's sake. Like they've got stuff in places that are totally extraneous to their interests, whereas China concentrates its forces on its strategic objectives, as the country should. Secondly, the US wastes a lot more money than China does when it comes to military spending. The average dollar goes further for China than it does in the United States. But even with that, even with all of that problems, like the US still has a more powerful military than China today. However, 10 years from now, like we're talking short time scales now, like a decade, it's not clear what it'll look like. And the United States economy is the largest in the world, but China's continues to grow. Will eclipse the United States, very soon, in the next few years, most likely. And unlike Japan and other countries, has the potential to keep on growing pretty much in the near indefinite future, because each individual Chinese person only has to produce as much as 1/5 or 1/6 of the American worker in order for Chinese GDP to eclipse that of the United States. Who thinks that that's not going to happen, right? So one of the worst arguments that I hear is that for why China won't overtake the United States, because some people still believe that. They say, well, look at Japan. People were talking about Japan overtaking the United States in the 1990s, and that never had. Japan has just fallen by the wayside. Yeah, they seem to assume that the same people that thought Japan was going to overtake the United States are the same people who think that China is going to overtake the United States. And that's not the case. I never, ever thought that Japan was going to overtake the United States. That was always a ridiculous misnomer. And the reason is like not that many people in Japan relative to the United States, right? So each individual Japanese worker would have to produce 2.5, 3 times as much in order for Japan to exceed the United States. It just was never logical. And that logic is completely reversed for China. Like, who thinks it can't? Because your only explanation for that is that China's economy per person remains extremely low in perpetuity forever. And that is simply just not plausible. So short of another catastrophic implosion, another civil war, another war with neighbors and so on, just in terms of normal development, that will definitely happen. But to answer your previous question, the conflict between the United States and China, what you have is one country that's been established for as long as it can remember, and sees itself as having a global destiny. The world is run in English. It is set by post-World War II norms and values and ways of doing things, everything from the Refugee Convention right through to the laws of the seas and so on. Like these are all set by American norms, okay, backed by American military power. Whereas China, which doesn't have a role in creating these norms, sees itself as having been taken massively advantage of by foreign powers during the so-called Century of Humiliation. They went through an extraordinarily long period between the fall of the Roman Empire right through to the start of the Industrial Revolution, where they were arguably the most powerful nation on earth, the Middle Kingdom. Okay, and so for them, it's just a normal correction to the long-standing norm, and that America's power has just been a blip, and they will fade back into history. As the world naturally reverts back to a Sino-centric world order. Neither one of those countries is going to tolerate the vision of the other. And therefore, the conflict is the inevitable result. You'll find people that are less pessimistic than me, and for your own sanity, you might want to seek them out. But there are people doing entire research institutes on how to avoid conflict between the United States and China. I know Graham Allison is at Harvard trying to do a lot of this work, but I think it's just futile. Don't focus on that. Focus on how you're going to win, because it's inevitable, right? And I don't think nuclear weapons are going to stop that from happening. So nuclear weapons have been a game changer in that it's not as clear that you're going to win a war, or at least meet your strategic objectives at an acceptable cost, as it was in the past, right? Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, there is that working assumption all around, right? So let's say you have a lot of nukes and I have a lot of nukes. You do something provocative on the assumption that it's not so important to me that I'm going to use nuclear weapons to stop you, right? Mm. Ergo, I use normal military forces to stop you, and we have a war. You assume I'm not going to use nuclear weapons. I assume you're not going to use nuclear weapons. That assumption is going to hold to a point, right? And at some point, that assumption is going to fail. So I think nuclear weapons, that the circumstances in which you wonder whether or not you'll use them is a different circumstance into when you acquire them, right? So you build and acquire nuclear weapons and you do them for these purposes and contingencies. But then as you enter a crisis, that situation has evolved. Like, so for example, with COVID, I do a daily update for those people that only follow us on YouTube. And that daily update's been running since the very start of COVID. And early on, I foreshadowed to everyone, like, your daily life is about to change dramatically. This is now that this disease has escaped China, I know that there hasn't really been much discussion about what it means, but everything that you think is true is no longer true. Okay, the government is going to totally dominate everything you do. You won't be able to go outside. You won't be able to buy stuff. You'll be stuck where you are. And these weren't like dire warnings. These were just actual kind of mental preparation. Like, these are the things you need to start thinking about. And I did sound like a bit of a crackpot, right? Because no one could have imagined the whole world economy shutting down and people being in lockdown and that the government would, control like where people go for get takeaway and things like it just didn't seem plausible.
Yeah, and like having police surveillance neighborhoods and knocking on people's doors,
shutting down all schools, shutting
down schools,
transportation, shutting down borders, like we all
having
these
to protest to get a haircut.
Yes, I mean, but this is the thing. You'd have these governments that were talking about open borders and say, like, the EU, let's all further integrate. And then as soon as COVID hit, these same governments were the first to slam the borders shut, right? People were not mentally ready for that change. And so I was doing my best to kind of help people, and you kind of got a bit of attention once these things happened, of course. So I thought that it was a really important thing to do to keep those updates going. Now, people have kind of acclimatized to it now, for better or worse. And so the daily updates are more for people's interest as part of their normal routine. And so if people are not ready for the different world in which nuclear weapons could be used, like it's I'm not now. Okay, I want to be very cautious about this. I'm not saying because COVID happened we're going to have nuclear conflict. No. I'm saying that there is a working assumption that certain things can never happen, but they are possible. There is an irreducible risk that will happen. And what will happen is increased conflict between the US and China. Yeah. It would be very dangerous to assume that nuclear weapons would, prevent that conflict, because it won't. That's the part that I can say. Okay. There'll still be a conflict between the US and China, irrespective of nuclear weapons. The worst thing would be for the leaders involved in that conflict to assume that within the context of that conflict, it can't escalate to nuclear use. It can, and there's a logical progression in which it would, just as there was a logical progression of how COVID shut down everything, right? Like, at first, it's hard to imagine an end state where just weeks, months away, everybody's shut down, right? But looking back in hindsight, looking back as history, people can see the pattern of how that all happened, right? It's the same thing with conflict between the US and China.
So what can we do about it? What can I do about it as a citizen?
Well, as I said, I mean, I'm not the guy for that. Like,
who can I go to?
Go to read up on all the work by Graham Allison, because he understands, first of all, like, he's not one of those deniers that just, like, he sees the risk is absolutely real, and he wrote a very good book called Destined for War, which goes into, the rising power and established power and the conflict that happens between those two, and uses a lot of historical examples to demonstrate the point. So if you want to avoid conflict, then there does need to be highly imaginary, revolutionary thinking around how to manage great power relationships in a time of great change and strategic transformation across the world. Like, because nearly all the historical comparators end in conflict and war. It would require new thinking. Now, I don't believe that you can just imagine away gravity. So I just don't buy into it. I'm sorry. I'm too much of a realist to be like, look, now, but I would not discourage anyone, because A, it's a worthwhile cause, peace, absolutely worth taking risk for and going with a long shot. And B, the world isn't made better by the realists. It's made better by the idealists who do imagine things that are, that help the world and make things better that weren't thought of as being possible previously. I don't think it's possible. So I don't. But this is one of the few areas in which I wouldn't want my own opinion to colour other people's, because I think that just because I don't think war is possible to avoid between the United States and China doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile thing to try. Just like there are plenty of people that don't believe in angels, not many people that don't want to. There's a worthwhile thing to pursue. But I guess to start with is, first of all, there are certain things that can be done. One, think about at a very practical level. Think about where the most likely flashpoints are: Korea, Taiwan, South China Sea, Guam, places like that, and think of like how to manage crises in those situations, because a big conflagration is unlikely to start because both sides plan it out carefully and wage a preemptive war. What will happen is that neither side expects things to escalate. Neither side is adequately prepared to handle a major escalation, and things spin out of control, and bad communication leads to something terrible, right? So managing those flashpoints is a place to start, but that's crisis management. That's to try and avoid a conflict from arising by mishap, okay? And that reduces some of the risk. Where I think it's impossible is dealing with the structural forces, particularly in China's case, because as I think I said it to you off camera, it's much easier to convince people to give up something they haven't yet got than it is to give up something they currently have, right? So this is true with climate change. If you ask people, would you forego being 2% richer if the world's climate was completely saved, right? Everyone says yes, okay? If you say the same thing but you would be a bit poorer, a lot of people say no, okay? So in the United States case, they are the dominant power of the world. Their Western liberal tradition is the predominant tradition in the world. And therefore, it's impossible to ask them to give that position of up, right? And for China's case, it's just as bad, because they're not just future aspiration. They're not emerging for the first time. They're seeing things going back to a long-standing norm. So they're like that gambler who's lost half the rent money, wanting to win it back. They're not willing to settle for anything less than their total aspiration, particularly since they're propelled by what they see as historical injustice against the Western powers, against Japan. And so, unless one side gives way. So the most likely way to avoid conflict would be for one country to implode. As in, like, there's a domestic revolution where their national, like, they get embroiled in a domestic conflict that means they don't have time to worry about anyone else. And that so for example, if the United States fell into another civil war, right? And they're, the blue states and the red states went and had a conflagration, well, they probably wouldn't have time to think about China, and they wouldn't have the power and strength to challenge China, so they would gracefully withdraw from Asia and allow China to expand and take the place. So that's or something else exhausts them. So, for example, the one major case where there wasn't a conflict, it was a peaceful transition, was between Britain and the United States. One of the reasons is they'd already fought their wars; they'd had previous wars in the past, but also the British Empire exhausted itself fighting fascist Germany, so it didn't have the strength to challenge America's rise, and was completely decimated by war, and relied on the United States to create a stable international order, which the Americans at that point were willing to do. So that was a peaceful transition. So that's another system in which, if something terrible happens,
so one country then the other.
Yeah, if they're no longer peer competitors, then they don't have a conflict, right? If
That's
one
terrible. I'm like in my head, compromise, but I can see what you mean because they're two different.
Well, someone proposed like a concert of Asia, which is like an akin to the concert of Europe, where what you have is an explicit coalition of balancing forces, where one country agrees not to do something that invites a coalition of other countries, but I mean that doesn't. I would say that won't work in Asia. It didn't really even work in Europe, where it was tried. The whole thing was set up after the Napoleonic Wars to try and stop another war from like it, because Napoleon played for dominance of Europe, right? So the other European powers sort of informally agreed to like balance each other out, so they wouldn't have someone with the aspiration to take over everybody. And that held together sort of until probably 1870, when Germany invaded France, and then obviously collapsed in World War I completely. And actually it was the alliances that sort of undid it, because it turned an assassination of an archduke in Austria or Serbia to start the war across all of the world. So yeah, no, I am very pessimistic. I think it's much better just to prepare for the conflagration to come than it is to try and avert it. But that is not something I would inflict on other people.
Have hope, people. If you have any suggestions, put in the comments.
Yeah.
I'll definitely have a read. We'll put it in the description as well.
Foreign service. So it's just, it does matter, but that's not a bad thing. That's like, I don't believe it. Why is this keeping happening?
So in a world where we have coronavirus, in a world where China and US are like head to head, in a world where I can't even really afford a house, what can young people do? Where do young people sit now in this volatile world? Let's try to be positive.
Yeah, no, look, I'm processing the question, and if there was a question that was more important than the US-China thing, that would be it. So you're pretty solid here. The first of all, the young people are the only hope that the world has. So keep that in mind, young people. That it's you. Whenever older generations blame younger people for stuff, when we get all these tropes about the kind of entitled millennials and stuff like that, keep in mind that all of the world's problems are created by older people. Right?
That's right. Go on.
But it's true, but you don't have the luxury, unfortunately, of using their resources to solve the problems, because it is quite likely that it's going to be harder for this generation than previous generations in many ways. Add to that is the problem, like I sort of alluded in another episode, where the source of moral direction, of orientation in the world has been taken away. Like that. And I said, like, this isn't like, I can have conversations about the value of the church, its pros and cons, but what it did have was a structure of how to be in the world.
We have corporations now.
Exactly. We have corporations that are trying to be virtuous, but not actually virtuous in terms of their own integrity, i.e. pay their workers and have ethical supply chains, but be virtuous in their signaling in terms of what it means to be a good person. And if you deviate from that, you're a bad person. The first thing that young people need to do is to try and be a little bit better than they were the day before. This is something that, like, if there's one bit of advice, is that everything is incremental change. You look around here in this podcast studio, if you've been a long time viewer, and by a long time we haven't been around that long, but you will have seen marked change over that time, and you'll continue to see those changes because we make little improvements as we go based on feedback, and we don't compare ourselves to the best, most established platforms in the world. We compare ourselves to how we were in our previous episodes and how we can continue to iterate and improve.
Yeah,
and
I have that like rule with like the 1% rule. It's like, hopefully like this video is 1% better than our last video. That's
a great rule. Yeah, and that's a rule that people can apply to their own lives. What determines success isn't who the wealthiest person in the world is and where you sit relative to that person. It's not even where you sit relative to your neighbor. It's where you sit relative to yourself yesterday. Okay, like if you can identify those areas where are somewhat deficient and you make improvements, then you are a success, right? The other thing is that, and I don't want to sort of push Stoic philosophy in this place, because I'll can do that in a separate podcast and contextualize it. But you can divide everything in the world between things you can control and things you can't control. And in the world today, there's far fewer things that you can control or perceive to control than has been previously, right? And so to be very clear about what's beyond your control will help you deal with life. Like a good pathway is to be like, is it something you can control? Then don't worry about it. If it's something you can't control, then don't worry about it, right? Like you need to take everything as it comes. Realize that if you continuously improve, learn from mistakes, learn from errors, everyone makes them, then you'll be able to muddle through. Another thing is that everyone's walking on thin ice. Like there is a level of existential angst that everybody today, particularly bright, young, intelligent people, have to live with, that isn't obvious on their Facebook feed, right? Like it's something that is true for them. So, don't substitute what corporations say. Don't substitute social media projection for actual truth and the character of human nature. People are in this together. So yeah, not alone. That's the core thing as well. And don't think of it in terms of outcomes. So I play poker pretty obsessively. One of the big disruptions has been poker, obviously, because it's highly connected with other people and it's hard to play and hard to travel for poker. But in poker, it's process, not outcome, right? Did you make the correct decisions in the situation you were presented yourself with? Did you bluff correctly? Did you analyze the mathematical outs that you had correctly? Did you bet the right amount? Did you accurately reflect your own image at the table and take a correct decision in that context, all the information that was given to you by others? What you can't control is the next card that comes out. If you're all in and you made the right decision and you lose, well, that's not your fault, right? You made the right decision and you can't control. It is absolutely possible to not make mistakes in life and still lose. So don't get tied up in status and success. The other thing is, like I said, with the survivorship bias, for every success, there are countless failures, right? And the difference between a success and a failure may not be quality, right? Like look at 50 Shades of Grey, okay? Well, like, if it's clearly not the best written book, right? It's not the greatest
Twilight fan fiction.
And yet it made an absolute fortune. So the correlation between success and quality is less clear than is often the case. But one should absolutely strive for quality, right? Success is something you can't control. And no one should have malice towards that author who made a fortune, because she didn't control the fact that it went completely insane across the world, right? Like it wasn't something in her power. She wrote a book, expressed herself in the book, which is great, and the book was extremely popular. We can't judge her for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's always an element of like luck, but they always say that like luck is also like preparation plus like timing or something. Like that's why you should focus on your progress towards it rather than outcome, because you're just increasing your chance of success or whatever you deem that to be.
Absolutely. And the one thing that we dwell on that a bit, because don't be resentful. Don't think about those emotions that make you less of a human being, right? Those things that prevent you from being your best self. And this is not me lecturing. Like, for example, if I'm hungry, or I'm or if money's an issue, or like if there's stresses in my life, I can be less courteous to other people, right? Like I can just not be thinking about them or their problems, or have the time for them that I really should. And my challenge is to not do that, to be reliable enough that when people interact with me, they know what they're going to get, right? And that will be value to them and hopefully value to this audience. And so, young people, this kind of guidance is just not common enough, because one thing that is very loud at the moment is a sense of having the right and wrong opinions, right? Like what makes you a good person isn't how you identify your own faults and how you work on those, and what those problems are, right? Is it procrastination? Is it intolerance? Like whatever it is, you can work on that, and that makes you, and that will make you, as Charlene says, more successful, even if the outcome isn't, like, it will still be better than it otherwise would have been, right? Like, for example, let's say you're overweight, right? And, put aside the reasons for that. Let's say you want to lose weight, okay? Your daily struggle to do that and to work towards that goal will make you more appealing and interesting a person, right? Like, it's the fact that you're taking on that sacrifice and making that effort. The outcome of the journey isn't really as important as what you learn along the way. So, that's a very basic example. It's not obviously a whole life trajectory. It's, how to be, a good partner, how to be a good employee, how to be a good employer, how to realize your long-term goals, all of that stuff. That all plays from that. But in short, focus on what you can control. Make the distinction between what is and what is not in your power. Focus on the process, not the outcome, like the journey. And to, as Charlene says, just make a 1% incremental change in your life every day, and try, to compare yourself to your own standards of who you were before. And if you're a better person than you were before, however you measure that, then you are a success. And that uncertainty in this world doesn't compare to that. It's your own judgment that is the important thing here.
Very true. Very true. Oh, we learned so much today. On that take, definitely as a young person, it is really, really confronting. But yeah, what you've said, Crispin, is very true. we're all in the same boat. I don't actually. Off question. What do you constitute as a young person?
Well, however old I am, a bit older than that is probably the cutoff.
Okay.
Charlene does not make me feel like a young person, put it that way.
Yeah. I know, I will come to you for advice, because you're old and wise, and then I offended him. But anyway, I think that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you have value out of this, I'm being Crispin right now. If you have value out of this, please consider liking and subscribing, because it really helps the channel grow. And yeah, any comments, leave in the description, leave down below. And we'll see you, or see me next week. Yeah.
Thanks. Ciao.